Good evening. I'm Steve Target, Chair of the Program Committee of the Union League Legacy Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Public Affairs program. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League. We're guided by the United States Constitution, the history and values of the Union League, and the Foundation's goal is to create a more informed, more engaged citizen leader. Well, we do this through dozens of programs, lectures, and exhibits, including programs like tonight's Public Affairs program. All of our programs of the Legacy Foundation are made possible through voluntary contributions from Union League members and others in the community who share our values. So thank you all to our generous donors for making these programs possible. Tonight's program will run about an hour in length, and toward the end of our program, our guests will take questions from our audience. To ask a question, use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get to as many questions as possible. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, a fellow Union League member and also a member of the board of the Union League's Legacy Foundation, my friend, Edward Terzansky.
Steve, thanks very much for the introduction. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. For those of us of a certain age, we were fortunate enough to grow up at a time when we were excited and inspired by the American space program. Mercury, Apollo, Gemini, the Atlas rocket, the Saturn rocket, Chuck Yeager, the space shuttle, even the Starship Enterprise. All of these names conjure up within us tremendous pride, but also an inquisitive nature. And for those reasons, our guest tonight has one of the neatest, coolest jobs in the country. Dr. Derrick Pitts is the chief astronomer and the head of the Fells Planetarium at the Franklin Institute right here in Philadelphia. And he's here tonight to tell us a little bit about how he got into this very cool job, and then to take us into the stars in the new space race and the new age of space exploration. So with that said, Derrick Pitts, welcome.
Thank you so much, Ed, and good evening, everybody. My thanks first to the Union League Legacy Foundation for inviting me to participate in this event this evening. I hope the information that I present this evening you'll find exciting and intriguing. And Ed, I think it will take us right back to that time. That was such an exciting time when we had so much pride in the American space program. Things have changed in a dramatic fashion, and we're going to talk about that this evening in the program. And what we're going to do really is we're going to set a context for our audience so that everybody can understand where things stand right now in terms of human space exploration. And so by the end of the program, you'll all be caught up to speed and you'll be ready to jump on board and ready to go for the next great race into space. I have been at the Franklin Institute now for a pretty long time. About 43 years I've spent now at Franklin Institute working in astronomy and space science, and doing my best to help keep everybody up to speed on where we are in these topics so that everybody has a good understanding of what's happening out in the universe, and also helping people find their way around the night sky as well. You know, one of the programs that I've been doing recently has been Night Skies at Home, a Franklin Institute program that you find on the Franklin Institute's Facebook page on the first Thursday evening of every month at 7:45, in which I walk us through the night sky and get everybody up to speed on what's available to be seen at this time of this year. So you can look for me actually next month. We've already done the December version of that program, but that information is readily available at the Franklin Institute's webpage anyway. So the time that I've spent at Franklin, I've been really fortunate, Ed, in that I've been able to work with so many people within the space program, within NASA. I've done a number of different projects off and on with NASA, either education programs or even some exploration programs. I've flown stuff on Space Shuttle, and I've flown materials on International Space Station, and have had the opportunity to meet a number of astronauts and do all kinds of really cool things like that, and get a really good inside view and understanding of what America's space program has been like and what the agency NASA has been like. And so in my program this evening, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up so that we can get a good understanding of what that first generation of space race was like. We'll move on to the second generation, a third generation, and then what's next. And all of these sections we'll put into context where we come to today. There's even some exciting news about something that's happened today that I'll incorporate into the program as well. So let's get started, and we'll learn about what's coming up for the new Race for Space. I'm going to share my screen here, folks, so everybody can join into the program. So if you'll give me a second as I get things set up here, we'll get things rolling, and you'll be able to participate. You'll see our program. Now, during the program, I'll ask that you please think of questions that you'd like to ask. I really want to find out what you want to know about and hear comments from you. So please send us your questions. I think they're coming to us in the Q&A box. So please make sure you put them there. I also want to say that I'm going to move on at a fairly rapid pace because there's a lot of material here, but I want there to be time for you to ask your questions. And we can always go back and revisit something. And the program's being recorded so that you'll be able to go back and review it again later. Okay, so let's get rolling. So the new Race for Space. You know, this is a program that I think about often. I think I've done several different iterations of this because of the kinds of advances that have taken place over the years since the space race of the early 1960s, late 50s and 1960s. And that first generation of space flight, people will recognize by some of these iconic rockets that you see on your screen here. And these iconic rockets also represent those companies or those countries that have space agencies or have companies that have developed the capability for space flight. We have to keep in mind that the original reason why we started developing space flight was to allow us to take that high ground position of defense, militarily speaking, against the Soviet Union. And so the first space race was between America and the Soviet Union, vying to get control of that particular space so that either one of us could have a superior position over the other. And that really formulated itself into what we came to know as the race to send the first men to the moon. And many people don't realize that as that race began, we sort of were aware that the Russians were in it. But what we didn't know is that when the Russians realized they were not going to beat us to the moon, the Russians dropped out of that race altogether. We didn't know that until well after we had been to the moon several times, but they realized that they could not make it before we could. And we all know how that turned out. So what we have here is we have what we can see currently of these countries that are firmly in the space race. There's the Russian Soyuz launch vehicle, which has been around for quite some time and is a very, very dependable rocket. And the Russian space agency, Roscosmos, has been using this rocket since the 1960s with not very much change and alteration. If it works, why fix it? I think is one of the things they say about this. But it's been highly reliable, highly dependable, and has been the rocket that we've used since 2011 to take astronauts from the United States up to International Space Station. So that's been a major player in our access to low Earth orbit. Next, you'll see the American Delta IV rocket, which is a heavy lift launch vehicle that we've been using. The French company Ariane has created the Arianespace rocket that is a commercial system that carries satellites into orbit for companies and countries all around the world. It's a fee for hire service. And if you can pony up the bucks, you can get a ride to send your payload up to space. The Chinese National Space Agency rocket Long March is what we see next. And this is the vehicle that's been responsible for all of the access that China, all the progress that China has been making into space in the last decade or so, which not only includes small space stations, but also includes spacecraft that have landed successfully on the surface of the moon, on the far side of the moon in the last year. And just this week, their lander on the surface of the moon on the backside has collected materials that they intend to return to Earth from the moon within the next several months. So they've been making steady progress in their work towards getting a better foothold in space. The Japanese Space Agency, JAXA, has their H2N rocket, which they've been using to carry payloads into space. And they're looking to begin a human space program, but have not really begun that in earnest yet, they've been working with us as our partner in International Space Station, along with the Russians, Canada, and a number of other countries around the world. And of course, the venerable Saturn V rocket, which is the rocket that carried astronauts to the moon. And this again is, I should say that this particular rocket, the Saturn V, certainly is the iconic launch vehicle that everyone around the world knows as the major launch vehicle of the late 1900s, the late 20th century. So let's get into the second generation. That was the first generation of spaceflight, when spaceflight was being conducted by those countries that had the technological capability and those countries that wanted to become players on the space stage. These are countries that have developed economically enough that they want to put themselves out there on the stage and show them as world powers, as players. And only the biggest countries can do this. And it seems as if this is a pinnacle expression of how they've arrived on the stage as major players on the world stage, is to have a space program that they can show what their strength and power actually is. We come now to the second generation, and the second generation of space flight takes a different direction. It goes in a different direction and takes a turn, in that rather than space being the purview of just national space agencies and perhaps a large commercial firm that creates launch vehicles to carry payloads into space, there now are other entities, companies, private companies that have developed the technological capability to launch payloads into space. What you see on your screen right now are two of those major players in this system that has now emerged. One of them you may be very familiar with, the other one you won't be familiar with, but that familiarity comes in interesting ways. So first of all, there's the Blue Origin system. Blue Origin is a system that is funded by Jeff Bezos of Amazon. Yes, you already know Amazon, but you may not know that the president and CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, is heavily invested in developing a system that will provide easy access to low Earth orbit using a reusable launch vehicle. And that's what you see here, the first image of the Blue Origin launch vehicle on a test flight. Now, just next to that, to the right of your screen, you'll see one of the prototypical rockets of the SpaceX system. Now, you may already know of SpaceX, and you may also already know of its president and CEO, Elon Musk. Elon Musk also runs a company called Tesla that creates those really beautiful electric cars that we see on the road these days. And what we see in these two companies is the expression of two people who happen to have the financial wherewithal, personal wealth, to create companies to satisfy a dream they've had since they were children. And that dream is to have access to low Earth orbit, to be able to get into space quickly. And in the case of these reusable launch vehicles, in a much more economical fashion. And so the major piece about this happens to be that reusability. Now, in this second generation, it not only includes this kind of access to orbit, but it also includes space stations. And we've seen here, this is the expanding non-governmental organization corporate development side of this, but there's also an expanding international development as well, because these are not the only companies that are doing this. There are others around the world, and other countries are stepping up their game, as we'll see as we go on. So this is the beginning of that second generation. Let's dig into that a little deeper. So here we are, Space Station. International Space Station is about the size of a football field. It orbits Earth once every 90 minutes at an altitude of about 225 miles up, flying at 17,500 miles per hour. At any one time, there are typically 6 astronauts on board, representing a number of different countries around the world, but primarily the crews are Russian and American, with guests from other nations that are partners with us in the endeavor of operating this spacecraft. International Space Station has been dominating near-Earth orbit since the year 2000. So for the last 20 years, there have been people living and working on board International Space Station. If we extend it just a little bit to include the earlier Russian space station Mir that came before International Space Station, there were about 5 to 10 years of that operation. we can certainly say that if you are under 25 years of age, there has never been a time in your life when people have not lived and worked in space. So since 2000, at least since 1995, 1990 even, we've no longer had everybody, every human on planet Earth. Think about that. That's a major step, a major transition for us. And it's an important one because it actually is the, how can I say, the credo or the mission of one of the commercial operators for bringing people into space. And we'll see what that is. So now let's talk about the fabulous company SpaceX. SpaceX is one of these second generation companies that is developing this technology to get into space at a low cost and with high frequency. Now, the major component of SpaceX, or the major engineering of the SpaceX company that makes it stand out, is its implementation and use of reusable rocket boosters. We can see a really lovely image here of what's called the Falcon 9 Heavy, where you have a central core rocket with two other rockets on the outside, and this gives enough thrust to carry heavy payloads into orbit. And SpaceX has been able to launch this successfully a number of times. And the launches really look great. And there are a number of platforms, launch platforms, rockets that are available through SpaceX to carry your payload into space. You can use the Falcon 9, which is just a single rocket core, the Falcon Heavy, which is the center core with the two outer ones. Dragon is their capsule that gets placed atop the rocket that can carry either supplies or crew up to International Space Station. And the next endeavor on their docket is Starship. And this is a spacecraft that's intended to be used for Earth supersonic transport, for explorations of Mars, and for delivering supplies and people out to the moon. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But there's a really great image of the launch and the landing, as you can see here. But here's the thing that has really made it stand out. Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy rockets have landed successfully dozens of times. And the whole idea is this. If you're going to boost something up into space, you're going to use a booster rocket to push the payload up to the altitude you want it to get to. Typically, what you'll do is you'll use that booster, you'll use up all the fluid, all the fuel and all the oxidizer, and you'll just let everything fall back down into the Earth's atmosphere and either burn up on reentry or fall into the Earth's oceans. And then when the next time comes for the next launch, you'll have a new one of those. Well, the idea here is instead of just throwing the booster away, why not recover that booster, clean it up, refuel it, and reuse it? Well, if you could manage to get it back easily and in a fashion that is non-destructive, shall we say, then maybe that could open the door to actually making spaceflight much cheaper. So let's take a quick look. I think I have a great video here that will help to show this. So this is 4 screens, and here's what I want you to look for. In the upper right, you'll see the central core booster coming down. In the lower 2 images, you'll see cameras on 2 boosters that were the side boosters. Now you see the central core firing, and in the upper left corner, look for the 2 rocket boosters to land simultaneously. That one action, ladies and gentlemen, completely changed the landscape of access to Earth orbit for all the players around the world. No other company was doing this before SpaceX did it successfully. And trust me, they didn't get it right the first time. They blew up and crash landed a number of rocket boosters before they got it right. But since they got it right now, about 4 or 5 years ago, they've landed their boosters dozens of times on their barges that they have out in the Atlantic Ocean to allow the rockets to have a safe landing spot. They've also landed them back at the launch site where the rockets took off from. And this again has opened the door to provide this low access to low Earth orbit in ways that simply hadn't been possible before. Okay, so we're going to move forward here. It's going to take me a moment just to jump out of my video here and have us go a little bit forward. But that one act was the one thing that has changed the landscape for everyone. It's changed the landscape for everyone because now others are trying to figure out how they do the same thing. How can they cut the cost? Now, this is important because if you launch the booster twice, you've already cut the expense of the booster in half. If you launch it 3 times, 4 times, you can see where I'm going with this. So now what this does is it puts SpaceX far and away ahead of everybody else around the world. But what's next for them? Starship. The idea of Starship is that it's big enough to carry as many as 100 people at one time, or hundreds of times the amount of cargo that's normally carried on a booster up to space. This is meant to give the capability to send supplies to the moon, to resupply International Space Station, and one other thing that I think is really intriguing, but let's just see how big this actually is. Now, Starship is meant to replace all of the SpaceX rockets, and you can see some of the configuration here, where you can see the spaceship is on the top here, the booster is on the bottom here. The booster would have 39, not 42, but 39 Raptor engines that would push this payload out into space with all of the stuff that I mentioned just a moment ago. Far and away, much more payload than anybody else. But how big is it? Well, here's a view of the Saturn V, the legendary Saturn V rocket ship. But take a look at Starship. It's enormous. Now, you might think, is it really possible to do this? Well, the way the SpaceX company works is through iteration. They keep trying and trying and trying until they get it right. And that's what seemed to work for them really, really well. Now they rarely have failures of their trusted Falcon 9 and Falcon 9 Heavy booster system. So they're very successful at that. So what do they want to do with it? Well, they like to use it to provide lunar base capability, to be able to take enough payload to set up lunar bases really easily and to deliver a number of astronauts at the same time. They also want to use it to resupply International Space Station. Well, goodness gracious, if you sent this thing to International Space Station, you could send enough supplies for years because it's so big. But the capability allows it to do so much more than just that. They'd also like to use it for supersonic transport around the Earth. This is a spacecraft that they think will allow us to travel from one side of the planet to the other side of the planet in under 45 minutes. The idea is you get on board this thing, you take off from a launch location, the Earth rotates underneath you, you simply nose over and come back down on the other side of the planet. So you can do that in 45 minutes. Consider, it takes space station 90 minutes to orbit Earth once. If you're only going halfway around the planet, that's only 45 minutes. So there's great possibility here for all sorts of advancements and improvements. But here's the ultimate goal that Elon Musk and SpaceX have. What they want to do is they want to establish bases on Mars. Now, it sounds completely crazy, I know, but Musk really thinks this is possible. And as his company bites off the challenges one by one and solves them, they are clawing their way forward to actually making something like this a reality. Now, this is not happening next year, okay? Let's get that out right now. Not happening next year. Will it happen in the next decade? Musk seems to think so. I'm not sure I would bet on that. But just imagine the advances in technology that will come from this are really important. And so this is the vision that he has for Mars-based capability. You'll notice over on the left side of the screen, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 landing pads and launching pads for the Starship. And you'll see that there are several others in the image here that lead to the establishment of this base on Mars. Really futuristic thinking, don't you think? It's way out there. But just think, if we don't get half that far, just think of the technological development that comes out of it as it is. Well, guess what, folks? The current Starship prototype, SN8, flew 12.5 kilometers just about an hour ago today. The test flight was actually this afternoon, and I watched it just before the program this evening. It was spectacular. Look at the scale size of this. You can see the people in the bottom of the image give you an idea. And this is just the top of the launch vehicle. This is just the rocket on top. It doesn't have the rest of the booster on it. This only used 3 rockets to test, and it was a successful flight. When you look at the replay, you'll see that the landing was a little rough, let's say. But that was all part of the plan. They weren't really expecting it to be entirely successful, but it worked out nonetheless. But we have to go on, because here we come now to the another second generation player, and that second generation is this gentleman. Do you recognize who he is? Yes, this is Richard Branson of Virgin Atlantic. Remember Virgin Atlantic, the record company? And then Virgin Atlantic, the aircraft company. So what has happened is that Richard Branson has decided that this is a wonderful opportunity for him to get into the tourism industry through spaceflight. And so his company, Virgin Galactic, has now built capability for everyday people to become astronauts. Yes, folks, you can get aboard this spacecraft right here called Spaceship Two, and you can fly Spaceship Two up to the boundary of space in an afternoon just as a tourist. And you can spend about a half an hour in space in zero gravity as just an afternoon flight. You don't have to do all the extensive astronaut training. None of that is necessary, but you can fly aboard this. I'll show you what the inside looks like. It's really spectacular. So here's the exterior shown on several test flights. What happens is this is mated to a larger aircraft called White Knight that flies this up to about 50,000 foot altitude. And then at 50,000 feet, the Spaceship Two is dropped off, the rocket motors are fired, and up it goes to the edge of space. There have been several test flights so far. The actual tourist flights haven't begun yet. They're still working out some bugs to make sure everything is safe. But here's what the interior looks like. This is not your father's or your grandfather's spacecraft anymore. This is now modern, sleek, attractive, enticing, futuristic. All of those things we all wanted spaceflight to be back in the early 1960s. We thought it would be here by now. I certainly thought I would have my flying car by now. Where is it? Here it is. So there's room for you and 5 friends on board. We're looking out toward the back end of the spacecraft here. And you can do this for the low, low price of just $250,000. Yes, folks, that's right. We have a bonus for you today, just $250,000. Now you're saying, you got to be crazy. That's a lot of money. Well, just consider this. About 10 years ago, the Soviet Union was allowing visitors to go visit International Space Station at a cost of $20 million a pop. And you would stay 7 days. But just think about this. This is only $250,000, far less expensive, and you can do it in an afternoon. Not bad, huh? It's still expensive, but it shows you the direction in which things are heading, and that's what's important. Where's it going to fly out of? This place. Did you know this place existed? Spaceport USA at Las Cruces, New Mexico. Not far from Burnt Flats. I'm not sure if that's not some sort of a joke about what could happen if the flight doesn't take off properly. But in any case, this location actually exists. This is a spot that's been built, a facility that's been built to run these flights out of in New Mexico. So if you buy a ticket, you'll go to New Mexico, get on board the flight there, fly up to space for the afternoon and come back. And this is where it's taking place. It actually is in existence right now, and you can go visit it. It's there. So it's real. Now, has anybody purchased tickets for this? Anybody crazy enough to have purchased tickets for this? Yes, 400 people have purchased tickets and have been ticket holders for about 5 years. They're waiting for their chance to make this ultimate sort of bucket list junket to space, if you will, and you could do the same thing. But we still have further to go. In the second generation now, there's Blue Origin as well. Here's Jeff Bezos, as you can see, standing beside not only his rocket, but also the capsule. This configuration is called the New Shepard. And in the New Shepard, you have not only the reusable booster, but the capsule that goes on top that can carry cargo or carry crew to International Space Station. Now, here's the really interesting part about this. Both Blue Origin and SpaceX both have contracts with NASA to deliver astronauts and deliver cargo to International Space Station. Yes, they have contracts. So what does that mean? What that really means is that NASA is outsourcing some of the easy work that it can do. Easy work. Carrying supplies to International Space Station. Oh my goodness, come on, anybody can launch a rocket and get it to International Space Station. That's not hard. And it's a little harder to do crew, yes, because you have to make special provisions for their care and safety, but that's not really difficult either. So NASA is outsourcing this kind of work. And why is NASA doing it? Because NASA wants to go on to do the very big things, and that is exploration of the solar system. Do you realize that in the last 10 years, easily, NASA has sent a spacecraft to every planet of the solar system? Yes, either as a flyby or as a lander or as an orbiter. So we now have explored every planet of the solar system with a NASA spacecraft. So while you may have been thinking that NASA has been out of the game since 2011 when the last space shuttle mission launched, that's so far from the truth. What NASA has been doing is building up its infrastructure to be able to do this kind of work and to be able to explore all the planets of the solar system. So NASA is going to keep moving because they realize that these companies have the wherewithal, the capability to create these kind of futuristic interiors of spacecraft that really look inviting and pull people in and make you want to do this and reflect the future. Now, you might be asking, why can they do this and NASA not be able to do this? Well, just think about it. It's a very different situation for NASA. NASA is a government agency. So there's a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape. NASA has to have its budget approved by Congress. We all know how Congress operates these days. So how much progress do you think NASA can make if folks in Congress who have no space industry in their states are trying to rule on what NASA does? Yeah, there are political overtones and trappings to this that make it a challenge. So here's some of the boosters. You can see them in various sizes. We go everywhere from the Antares spacecraft on the far left and Soyuz on the far left, all the way through the the SpaceX, the Blue Origin New Glenn, larger than the New Shepard boosters, all the way out to the Saturn V, and you can see how big they are relative to that. So there really are new spacecraft coming online. The Air Force has already selected New Glenn for some of its missions to carry payloads up to space. So Bezos already has contracts with government agencies to make this happen. So this means that money is flowing in so that he can begin to create things like this. This is the Blue Origin suggested prototype for a lander to deliver astronauts to the moon. Yes, while the space programs of NASA for the next iteration of visiting the moon are working on building the rockets and building the landing and building the interim spacecraft between Earth and the moon, there hasn't been anything done yet for a lander to the moon. And here, Blue Origin has a plan for that. But they're not the only company that has plans for things in space. Did you know that there's a company called Bigelow Aerospace that builds inflatable components for use on International Space Station? Yeah, think about it. It's a big balloon. It's really just a big balloon. But think about the idea of a big balloon in space. You can fold it up to make it a small payload. You can use gas to expand it in space and bring it up to full size. And you can use it for lots of different components. Seems like a dream, right? Not exactly. I'm sorry, I don't have the image for that. I thought I did. But these are actually in use on board International Space Station right now. There's one of these inflatables connected to International Space Station right now being tested for use in space. It's been there for about a year. Very interesting, right? Yeah. We have another application we'll see in just a moment. But let's talk about some other countries that are still involved in this or are becoming bigger players in this new race for space. Well, the Russians are still there. Roscosmos is the National Space Agency of Russia. They're the ones responsible for the operation of the Soyuz launch vehicle and also for operations on board International Space Station. They want to stay in the space race too. They have designs of wanting to get back to the moon. They've always wanted to get to Mars, but they have had the absolute worst luck sending any kind of spacecraft to Mars. They've sent dozens of spacecraft out to Mars. None of them have made it. They failed in Earth orbit. They failed on transit to Mars. They got near Mars and suddenly disappeared. They've not had any luck at all, but they keep trying, and they have great engineering and great capabilities. So they're really wonderful partners for us to work with, believe it or not, because their experience is deep, their experience is broad, and they're really, really great engineers at this. You can see one of the Russian launch vehicles here. This is the Soyuz rocket being drawn from its hangar out to the launch site via a railroad car. The locomotive pulling it along gives you some idea of the scale. And here's a back-end view of the boosters that are used to launch their payloads to orbit. Again, a very, very reliable launch system that we've been depending on since 2011. And fortunately, with our fingers crossed, everything has worked pretty well with these launch vehicles. They head out to space from the steppes in Kazakhstan, and you can see what this looks like there. It's really a spectacular ride. But I have to tell you, it's cramped inside the capsule, and I do mean cramped. Imagine 3 people in spacesuits inside a Volkswagen in the front seat. That's what I mean when I say cramped. And often the astronauts have to take a 24-hour ride from Earth to International Space Station. So there are improvements that you can see with the spaciousness of some of the other new vehicles that we spoke of earlier, the New Shepard spacecraft and the Virgin Galactic spacecraft, and one of the others we'll see in just a few moments. Japanese National Space Agency, JAXA, has a module at International Space Station and will remain one of our partners as long as we run this program. So they're interested in expanding their capability as well. And the Chinese National Space Agency, as I mentioned, with their Shenzhou 8 spacecraft, docking with spacecraft Tiangong-1 just a couple of years ago, the Chinese are planning to launch a much larger space station in just a couple of years, expanding their footprint in low Earth orbit. It won't be as big as International Space Station is now, but it certainly does represent a major step forward. As I mentioned earlier, the Chang'e 4 lander on the backside of the moon has put out a rover called U2 that has been rolling across the backside of the moon. The first time any spacecraft has landed on the far side of the moon. And they've collected samples to send back to Earth, and that collection has been successful. And the return vehicle, I believe, has landed on the moon, will collect the sample and bring it back to Earth soon, something we haven't done automatically anywhere else yet. So they're really mounting their space program. But here's the 3rd generation. This is the 3rd generation now. And this 3rd generation is all about getting back to the moon and then going on to Mars. And NASA is really pushing this heavily as their next major mission to accomplish. So they are creating a whole system that allows us to go from Earth using International Space Station as a platform, a jumping off platform, and using new launch vehicles, the Space Launch System, the Orion spacecraft, and commercial launch vehicles to carry us up to the moon, land us on the moon, and allow us to develop the skills that we need to go on to Mars. So the moon becomes a major piece of the idea of heading on to Mars because we need a place to practice before we go on to Mars. Why is that important? The moon is 3 days away from Earth. It's over a weekend, a long weekend. Mars, that's a whole other beast. 6 months just to get there. Once you get there, you need to hang out for a year and a half before the 2 planets line up close enough together to make a short return trip to Earth. That's another 6 to 9 months. So we're talking about 2.5 years at least. So what do we have to do? We have to get suits together. We have to figure out the transportation. We have to figure out what the habitation system is going to be on Mars. And we have to prepare all this so that it's there at Mars before astronauts ever go to Mars. But it's all going to start with a new launch vehicle. And the United States needs a new launch vehicle. NASA needs a new launch vehicle, something that's big enough to take a big enough payload to take all the equipment we need out to the moon and then on to Mars. So the next super booster for us is going to be this one, SLS, the one that can take the heavy payloads out for us. Now, the idea of this is that it can take 95 metric tons to low Earth orbit, 27 metric tons to translunar injection, that's on to the moon. And so far to date, it's cost us $18 billion, and it looks like it's going to cost about $2.5 billion per launch. That's kind of expensive, actually. And to date, for the $18 billion spent so far, We don't have anything to show for it yet. We've done one test flight 2 years ago, and the next test flight isn't due until at least next summer. So if you think about the schedule of getting to Mars or getting to the moon by 2024, there's a lot in jeopardy here. There's a lot in jeopardy here. So what does this capability look like? These different rocket systems, the Falcon Heavy, the Saturn, the Space Launch System, and Starship, in comparison, show that one of the best ways to do this for the least cost is to use something like Starship, because its launch cost is low, but the amount of material it can carry is very high. So that's looking like that could be a really good alternative. And you ready for this? It's now beginning to look like NASA is considering that it should scrap building the SLS and just go with the commercial systems being created by SpaceX. We'll see how that develops in the coming year, but that's where it looks like it's going. We're also going to create a new crew capsule with an upper stage rocket motor. And this crew capsule will be a crew capsule that would ride on that spacecraft to take astronauts up to low Earth orbit and onto lunar orbit. Looks something like this, very much similar to what the Apollo spacecraft looked like, but it would be a lot bigger and have lots more room. It would fit on top of an Atlas V rocket, or it would fit on top of the Space Launch System, the SLS, and it's known as the CST-100 Starliner. This is the Boeing version of a new capsule that would be modeled after the Apollo capsules, but just much bigger with all modern equipment on board. So a very, very modern version of that would do that. Looks something like this. Such a great image, artwork, of course. But it certainly does show that some progress is being made. Is this as modern as any of the other ideas we've seen from the commercial companies? Or will it simply get the job done? How do we think about that? Where do we place ourselves in that? Let's take a look at the SpaceX Dragon capsule, for example. This was just flown with 4 astronauts to International Space Station last month. If you saw the images from the inside of the capsule, it is incredibly roomy and comfortable. Room enough for all 4 astronauts to take off their spacesuits and float around inside in comfort. Look at that design. Don't you want to fly on that? I certainly do, right? Look how much space there is. Now, this is all sort of fly-by-wire glass cockpit, all of the modern amenities that you would find in a spacecraft like this. Everything is touch screen. There are no switches, no knobs, no dials, nothing like that. All just like you have on your tablet or your pad. That's how everything is controlled. Of course, it's controlled from ground as well, but the astronauts on board can fly it just like that, just as if they're using an iPad. You know why they're smiling. They're excited about what's going to happen. These were the 4 astronauts, by the way, who are currently at International Space Station. All of these spacecraft will have the capability to dock with International Space Station on the left. You can see the Crew Dragon as it has docked with Space Station already. And the idea for how Boeing would do the same thing. But all of these spacecraft are meant to take us where? Onto that next stage that'll get us down to the moon. What's that going to be? A smaller version of International Space Station called Gateway. Gateway is going to be the station where astronauts come to and hang out in lunar orbit for a couple of weeks before they take a lander down to the surface of the moon. Now, the expectation is that astronauts would be on the moon for several weeks or several months at a time. So that's why they would spend so much time acclimating on board Gateway. Now, Gateway is a spacecraft to be built by NASA, but it hasn't been built yet. The contract for this has not been let yet. So if you think about where we are now at the end of 2020 with the idea of getting people to the moon by 2024, you can do the math in your head, can't you? Let's keep moving. Here's the goal. The goal is to get us back to the moon, to use the moon as staging, to develop our capabilities and skills to go on to Mars. But we need some kind of facilities to make that happen. So several companies are working on drafting up ideas for how to make surface capabilities for the moon. What kind of landers can be built that will serve the needs of astronauts on the moon for several months at a time. So Dynetics is a company that's in there, SpaceX is a company that's in there, and then there's the national team of Blue Origin, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, and Draper Industries that have gotten together to try to create something that might allow us to get down to the surface of the moon, establish some kind of a base where we can explore, do more research, and again, develop our skills and abilities to go on to Mars. Now, you remember I talked about inflatables a little bit earlier? Here's a really interesting application for inflatables. Take them out to the surface of the moon and use them as habitats. And we can either use them right on the surface with the proper kind of shielding, or we can actually put a sort of tube inflatable inside a lava tube on the moon, inflate that, and then use the natural cover of the lunar soil from inside the tube to protect us from the harsh environment. But we can create a living environment inside the tube. Not so crazy anymore now, is it? No, because it can be collapsible, easily transportable, and easily usable at the location. But of course, the next step is this one. The very next generation, beyond the third generation of going back to the moon, is going on to Mars. We saw this image a little bit earlier, but getting there is going to be a challenge. Round trip from Earth to Mars is 2,000 times greater than from Earth to the moon. Again, remember, I said it takes 6 months to get there at the very least. And if you're going to get there, you're going to spend a while. What would really be helpful is if we could develop a rocket technology that would allow us to travel much faster. We're going to need a faster boat if we want to cut down some of that time. You remember that line from the Jaws movie. We're going to need a bigger boat.
And Derrick, Mission Control just let me know that we're coming up very soon on the end of our time together. So if you could conclude with this, and let me throw some questions your way, and I promise I'll keep them tight so that we can cover a lot of ground.
You do that, Ed, and I'll just let the slides go on.
Okay?
Okay.
Give us an idea of the size of the International Space Station. How many people can be in there at once? What's the comparable size to a house? That kind of thing.
So International Space Station altogether is about the size of a football field. There have been as many as 10 people at International Space Station, 13 people at International Space Station at one time. It's not really built to handle that number of people for a long time. But the way you can think of it is think about having a series of maybe 6 to 8 20-foot campers all pulled together in a circle. It would be similar to something like that. That's a good way to think of it.
Great. In terms of propulsion, any concern about the environmental impact of sending so many missions from Earth orbit? Somebody had written about that. And then a related question, although not on the issue of environmentals, what about the kind of propulsion that you need to make it to Mars? Specifically, someone wrote that there's the concern about shielding from radiation, the added weight of that. Does it call for something beyond what we have today? And I think that's exactly where I interrupted you.
Yeah, well, as it turns out, this idea of going to Mars is a really wonderful, romantic idea, but there are all sorts of challenges that absolutely must be met. We do not have a solution for the intense radiation of the space environment that makes sense yet. We do not have a good idea for a better propulsion system that would make the trip to Mars much shorter. So those challenges still stand and have to be resolved before we can get there. So while it's nice to talk about this, Ed, and have that as a future goal, it sets it out there as a technological challenge for young engineers coming along to solve, to make it possible for us to get there. As far as rocket exhaust being an environmental problem, it would make sense for us to try to do our best to use rocket fuels that aren't damaging to the environment. Some of them are really caustic and really nasty, but we don't send that many rockets aloft that it makes has a really horrendous impact on the environment. So we still should do better to find rocket fuels that are less caustic to use.
So why does Elon Musk want to go to Mars? And if he worked out the details of how to get there, would you go, and why?
The reason why Elon Musk wants to do this is it's been a dream of his to try to make humanity a multi-planet species. That's what he wants to try to do. That's the goal he wants to try to achieve. And he thinks that his plan to settle Mars in 100 years might be the first step in doing that. Would I go to Mars? I would go to the moon. I would love to go to Mars, but the problem is there are too many issues that have to be solved right now. And the other major piece of this that's really important, and I'm not interested in a trip to Mars that's a one-way ticket. I want to be able to come back. And so while there have been
movie, you saw
yes, and there actually was a company about 3 years ago that was promoting this idea of sending the first person to Mars, or the first persons to Mars, with a one-way ticket. And they got a lot of really strong response from people who would do that. But of course it fell apart. They didn't have the money or the technology to make that happen. But last thing I need to mention about this is the idea of NASA returning to the moon is to get people to the moon as early as 2024, maybe as late as 2028. But there are a number of technological challenges that have to be solved and met before that can happen. And let's remember, this is already 2021. That leaves only 3 years to build a rocket, build the gateway, build the lander, test it all first before we send astronauts.
Derrick, what are China's intentions in terms of its space program?
Well, China's intentions in terms of its space program is to show the world that it deserves to have the same kind of status and recognition as both Russia and America. They want to show people that they are just as capable, if not superior, because their idea is to retake the stage as the leading country of the world. They feel like they held that position earlier in their history, and they should retake that position. So that's where they're headed. So space exploration is always the ultimate expression of a country's technological prowess and capability, and they always want to use that as a way to put themselves on center stage on the planet.
So it looks like the moon could become a very congested piece of real estate. Any sense as to how countries are determining what rights each country would have in terms of where they land, what they do when they're there, just sort of rules of the road for the use of the moon?
Yeah, the short answer is that the moon is treated through space treaty the same way that Antarctica is. Nobody owns it. You can go there for research. You can't use it for any nefarious purposes or anything connected to aggression or war or anything like that. And that's an international treaty that all the countries that have space capability have signed on to. So, and we don't see any reason why anybody would violate that, because flying in space is very much like being a seafarer. If you're out on the ocean in your ship, you are bound by duty to rescue any other ship that's in trouble. And so it's the same way for air flight. It's the same way for space flight, because one little slip, and that could be you. If there's somebody in a spacecraft near you and they could help you, then that's what you want to have happen.
Derrick, a number of people have raised questions having to do with this mix between government and private entities working toward what amounts to proprietary technologies, the sorts of things that used to be closely guarded national secrets. Do you have any concerns, or do you hear much discussion about how we're going to determine what intellectual property is shared between nations?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There are certainly technologies that will remain proprietary or national secrets, but in terms of, in those situations where we're talking about life-threatening conditions or situations, if you have to share the technologies to make sure that everybody lives, there have been ways in which those technologies have been not just shared, but shared and protected at the same time. So, going forward in the future, what we do know is that NASA has a technology sharing program to work with American companies, and that's some of the way in which these new innovations have happened in some of these other companies. But among internationals, the partners are all putting the same thing on the line. You bring something, we bring something. We're all going to share in this because we all want to achieve. And they all see this as a way to not only reduce cost of high-level, sophisticated space exploration, but they also get to reduce risk at the same time. So if you're a smaller country, but you have technological capability, you have something to bring to the table, let's all bring something to the table and we'll share so that we can all advance together.
We're getting really close to the end, but this is a burning question. So just today, a senior defense or an intelligence official in Israel said that, yes, there is life out there. In fact, he said Trump knows about it. He's not saying anything. Leave aside whether that's true or not. Is there life out there? Do we know about any? And if not, what are your thoughts?
There is absolutely no data. There's no information. There is no evidence at all that there is any other life out in space. The only place we know of anywhere in the universe for 100% certainty where there is life is here on Earth. Now, if you just work the numbers, there are trillions of galaxies. Each galaxy has billions of planets. If you take 1/10 of all of those planets that might have an environment where life could develop, you still have millions of planets for that to happen. If you take 1/10 of those and give them conditions exactly like the Earth, you still have millions of planets. And if you take 1 out of 10 of every one of those, why isn't it possible for life of some form to develop? That's not saying it would be just like this, but it certainly is possible, just given the numbers, that that's the case. Now, that could be the case. Does it have to be the case? No, it does not have to be the case. But there's no reason why it couldn't be the case. So I think we should proceed in that way.
Last question, short answer. The movie Armageddon, here comes the killer asteroid. Now NASA spots it. Every once in a while, we hear something came close. It just floated by. At some point, we're going to face a scenario like that, aren't we?
At some point, we are. At some point in the future, we are, Ed. Right now, we've done a really great job of identifying all of the Earth killer asteroids that are in the solar system. None of them are headed toward Earth anytime in the next 100 to 200 years. There are some smaller ones that might ruin our day in some regions of the planet, but we don't have to worry about Earth killers for quite some time. Hopefully in 200 years, we will have developed a technology that will allow us to push these off to the side and avoid that big smack.
Derrick, I'm going to take that as an answer that'll help me sleep tonight. Derrick Pitts, you were fantastic. When you go to the moon, I want to be there with you. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for being part of this program. Derrick, tell us where we can follow your work.
You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is @CoolAstronomer. And you can also follow me at the Franklin Institute on the Franklin Institute's webpage under astronomy or space or planetarium. I have plenty of blogs that I've written there. You can catch me every month, the first Thursday evening of the month, 7:45 on the Franklin Institute's Facebook page. We're talking all things space, astronomy, space exploration. Join us there. We'll take your questions there too.
Ladies and gentlemen, as promised, the guy with one of the coolest jobs in America, the cool astronomer, Derrick Pitts. Derrick, thank you so much. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in tonight. We look forward to seeing you the next time the Union League Legacy program brings you another show to watch. Thanks and be safe.
Thanks, Ed.
Cheers.